Hey everybody, terrific episode today, all about what we can learn from non-human animals about human health. Super cool guest, so smart, so interesting, such a unique area of research, and that was stumbled on in a serendipitous way. That's I love these kind of serendipitous discoveries in science where someone gets paired with someone else, or there's just this right combination of things that come together in some way that yields these incredible results that who knows how long it would have been before we discovered some of these things. So very excited for the show. Very excited because I just did the first Patreon board game night just last Saturday. It was terrific. Put a message out there for 8 people, eight Patreon supporters to meet up, do some board games. A couple people had played the game Codenames before. Some hadn't. It's a game that takes 5 minutes to learn. Probably going to explore some other things in the future as well. And it was, I have to tell you, I get nervous meeting any group of strangers ever, and I'm always nervous about how it's going to go. Even when I do live shows, meeting people after shows and stuff like that, I'm just not. I've never been good at meeting strangers, and it was a lot of fun. So it was, board games is one of my favorite things to do. It was fun to get to share it with fans. It was super fun that all the people that showed up were really awesome and cool to get to know a little bit and have some laughs and a good time. And so I'm doing it on a regular basis. Basically weekly. I'm going to go for 4 times a month anyway, and kind of rotate days of the week and time and stuff like that, so we can hit everyone that wants to try out a board game night. No experience necessary. If board games sound like I haven't played a board game since I was a kid and I played Monopoly or Sorry or Hi-Ho Cherry-O or something like that, and it was some silly thing that I stopped doing when I was 8. Well, let me tell you, the world has changed quite a bit. We got some hot new board games out there for adults, and really easy to learn, super fun to play, and so check it out. It's just a fun way to catch up. There's no like pressure to fill dead air and all of that. It's one of my favorite things about board games. Just into board games. Play more board games, everybody. And beefing up the Patreon, getting to work on beefing up the Discord a little more. It's kind of been in beta testing state. But it's been super active in a cool community. And so I'm finally, my goal now this year is to start launching things to really start getting a bigger community in there and start advertising it more, which I haven't done too much of yet other than just on this show to you guys. And so something worth checking out. And with that, I hope you enjoy today's episode.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. My name is Shane Mauss. My guest today is Professor Barbara N. Horowitz, and I am so excited to talk to you, Barbara. This is one of those podcasts where this is like the second one I've ever done in 6 years or so of podcasting, where I'm like, I hope that you enjoy this because I already want to have you back on sometime. Your research is so incredible. You have 2 fantastic looking books, which hopefully I would have a chance to read by spring or something up next year. My reading list is getting longer by the day. But your work checks so many boxes for this show and myself and my listeners. We talk about evolution on this show probably more than any other subject. We talk all sorts about non-human animals. Who doesn't love non-human humans? People go back and forth, but non-human animals. I dated a veterinarian for years. I'm into zoology. I've been to a bunch of zoos and interviewed zoo vets. This is just you just got a lot of amazing stuff going on. So if you could, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? And I also don't want to forget to mention your books as well. So if you could give a little introduction to those.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to be with you here and to have this conversation. Evolution and non-human animals and veterinary medicine and human medicine, all those connections. That's my favorite thing. I could talk about that, endlessly, and some say I do. So I am I actually am a physician. I'm a cardiologist and a psychiatrist. Actually, I trained in both specialties, and I practiced medicine, cardiovascular medicine, as a professor at UCLA for over 20 years. And then I had a serendipitous experience, which was literally a call from one of the vets at the LA Zoo who had a primate who had a cardiovascular problem. And they invited me to come and participate in the care. I was working, under the supervision of the veterinarians. But and my specialty within cardiology was imaging. So I got to the zoo and I imaged. I did an internal ultrasound on a chimpanzee. And to make a long story very short,
you can take as much time as you like, Barbara. You're welcome to blab on and on as long as I already know about your work. It's endlessly fascinating. So please don't feel rushed.
Well, you're very kind. I just, the reason that the origin story is important, but then I kind of touch it and I move off, is that, I had one of those experiences that, literally changed my life. Now, that is such a trite thing to say. It's like that's somebody doing a mockery of a TED Talk or something, but it literally happened to me and I wasn't looking for it.
You got the headset on for the motivational speaking and everything, right?
But so I was, 99% of the time I was taking care of human beings with heart attacks and, high cholesterol. A very typical academic cardiologist teaching medical students and all of that. And then periodically I was going to the zoo and taking care of, a gorilla with an aortic dissection, which is a tear in the aorta, which is a, common, not common, but a not uncommon form of cardiovascular disease in humans. And there was a lion who had almost 800 cc's of fluid in her pericardial sac. That's the sac in which the heart is contained. And they were discussing the possibility of metastatic breast cancer in this lion. And so, which was those kinds of diagnoses in non-human animals, it at that time blew my mind. Because here I had spent all these years, decades studying human medicine. I was, professor, and I did all this teaching and research. And I really hadn't given much thought at all to whether the diseases that I was taking care of human beings also occurred in animals. I knew about veterinarians, but mostly in my mind, that was about veterinary medicine was about infectious diseases, zoonotic infections. So here I'm at the zoo and I'm hearing about metastatic breast cancer in a lion. And I'm hearing about, osteosarcoma bone cancer that affects, adolescents and young humans in many different vertebrate species, and about heart failure. And there's a form of there's something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And it's the kind of heart problem that is responsible for athletes sometimes dying suddenly. So, when you read about, a basketball player or a swimmer or a runner who dies suddenly, very often it's this problem where the ridge of tissue that connects the right and the left ventricle becomes too thick. It thickens, and then there's this event, this sudden death event. Well, I started learning about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in kangaroos. And so I am having this parallel universe experience. And what ended up happening over the course of several years was I just couldn't stop thinking about how little I personally knew about the pathology of non-human animals, about non-human animals in general, and how few of my colleagues knew. And it was, so you had people who were absolute experts, specialists, world acclaimed in breast cancer and leukemia, and they didn't realize that jaguars in captivity primarily have an elevated incidence of breast cancer. All of the big cats do. There may be connections to the BRCA1 mutation. Leukemia, snakes and other reptiles are very vulnerable to certain leukemias. So here I was going to the zoo, coming back to UCLA and sharing this with my colleagues and finding that really there was this gulf between what physicians knew and what vets knew. And that ended up leading to my partnering up with the brilliant animal behaviorist, Catherine Bowers, and the two of us have spent now over a decade turning to the natural world to try to better understand human diseases, but also development. And so, it's been quite a ride, because I look back, even talking about it, to those early days, what I didn't know. One of the things that I'm most fascinated in now is mental illness in other animals.
Really?
So this is something that now I remember I finished medical school and I did full training in psychiatry. I did a full residency at UCLA in psychiatry. I was chief resident in one of the psychiatric.
Barbara, you just had to go and do all of the things. You didn't want to save anything for the rest of us, huh?
I have that training, and I really, I knew nothing about psychopathology in animals. And so one of the most mind-blowing and transformational experiences of being at the zoo was just, and then it was the zoo at first, and then it was going to veterinary conferences and going into the field and talking to wildlife biologists and just reading and experiencing and asking, was the compulsive disorders in animals, the anxiety disorders in animals, the syndromes that are so phenomenologically similar, let's put it that way, between animals. For example, feather plucking disorder that happens in certain bird species, and trichotillomania, which is a disorder where people sometimes pluck out their hair. So there are these parallels that we kept encountering. And so ultimately Zoobiquity, which is the first book that Catherine and I wrote together, which was published in 2012, that book is half physical health and half mental health. So
amazing.
It's been quite a ride.
And what an incredible blind spot that you've uncovered with this as well. Like, oh, animals have organs and things as well. I wonder if there's anything that we could learn from this. And by the way, I think we should make sure and point. A lot of people have a lot of mixed feelings about zoos. Maybe you could talk a little bit. I know from going to zoos, like I had just the incredible care and treatment that animals get there. I was in Dallas Zoo last December. They're giving acupuncture to some of their there's basically many of their mammals are living such unnaturally long lives that their spines are starting to fuse together, and they're doing acupuncture to help them through that, so they can age more comfortably as they live much longer than they would in the wild. But do you have anything that you'd kind of like to say for the listeners that have concerns about zoos?
Yeah, no, I would, but I want to also circle back to your question about the blind spot, because that's super relevant. And I think I think it's kind of one of the most interesting, for my own journey has been really kind of the most interesting part of it, is just realizing that I had a blindfold on and not even knowing it. And the experience of having that peeled back or pulling it back as a scientist has just been so revelatory. and rewarding. In fact, I start my classes, my undergraduate, I teach undergraduates at Harvard and at UCLA. And the first day I always say, check your human exceptionalism at the door, because it's a blindfold.
Yeah.
And it prevents us from recognizing connections that do exist and that can, really allow us to understand things better. But the zoo piece is, I'm glad that you brought that up. And it is. I mean, there's controversy about it in a way, but I think like all issues where there's emotion and complexity, turning lights on is really the way to go, and talking about the elements of it. What I am now deeply, my journey has transformed me, not only medically and scientifically, but it also has really caused me to feel that, in addition to climate, which obviously is a central, many people think the central issue, the loss of biodiversity and ecological degradation are, it's right up there in terms of what I'm worried about, and where I feel I can, where I'm working, I'm trying to focus on that. And I think that's where I kind of start when I think about the issue of zoos, in that, first of all, let's just say, of course, there are many examples historically, and probably some now, not really in the zoos or the aquaria that I've encountered in North America, and where the people who are working here are all about animal conservation and all about animal welfare. And so there's that. Now, of course, there are historical examples and examples of bad captivity. There's no way to deny that. And that is, obviously very negative.
And everyone watched the Tiger King at the start of quarantine this year too. So there's all these, which is a very, these kind of sanctuaries that aren't terribly legitimate, is a very different conversation too, usually. But
I'm glad you brought that up, because the term sanctuary is so beautiful and so lovely, and it sort of implies this sort of nirvana of like animal happiness.
Right.
But the issue of biodiversity really is absolutely central to this whole conversation, because when I think about the future of animals, the welfare of animals, my first thoughts are all of us should be working tirelessly to reverse the ecological degradation, the deforestation, the habitat loss, all of the global factors that are making it impossible for so many species to survive in their, where they come from, basically. And so we know that a significant percentage of the animals that are currently in zoos are, if not, highly endangered, somewhat endangered. Some are actually even extinct. And the point is that I think that people who care about animals, people who are, have a moral sense of our responsibility to the world, to the larger world as humans, would all agree that we need to be considering not just human welfare, but welfare of other species. So the question is, if we as a species cannot get our act together to reverse these global changes that are taking the homes and the habitats away from the millions of other species, then we need to really be focused on the stewardship of the animals that have been entrusted to our care. Mm-hmm. And so I think the conversation can't be a simplistic, bad and good. I think it's a complex conversation that I think, frankly, among people who mostly really do care a lot about conservation, a lot about animals. So it's complicated that way. I will say that it's also, I gave a lecture this morning to a group of psychiatrists. It was one of the national psychiatric groups. And one of my pitches to my fellow physicians is that, our health, our human health is very much linked to the health of animals. We know that, right? There's this blurring of the line between human and animal environments. We have more and more, companion animals in our homes. And our exposures, right? Our exposomes, the human exposome and the non-human animal exposomes are becoming more and more overlapping. And so the health of humans and the health of animals has become highly entrained. And so for that reason, selfishly, we need to be thinking about animal health and, educating ourselves about animal health. I was such an ignoramus. And that's that's not okay. I mean, I share that now because, frankly, I had a pretty high view of myself professionally. So it's not like but I honestly, I just didn't know. And I think that a lot of the medical profession still doesn't know. And that is not good for the human patients. But there's this additional responsibility because, I mean, so we've been on Earth, humans, about 200 or 250,000 years, right? And we've just, our presence has been completely catastrophic for so many, multitudes of other species. And so there's actually a moral responsibility that I think physicians ought to be kind of considering as part of the realm of what they're doing. Back in the 1970s and 80s when nuclear proliferation was a huge issue, right? Helen Caldicott, who was a physician, right? She started Physicians for Social Responsibility saying, hey, yeah, this is not your patient, at the bedside, but the fate of humans, the fate of the planet is kind of a medical responsibility. So
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding too for a lot of people where they think when they think about preserving species, they're like, oh yeah, okay, well, pandas are cute and we should keep them alive, not really understanding the full impact that biodiversity has on the entire planet and especially even if you just care about humans and you're very human centric and everything else, the biodiversity has a really huge impact on our lives and our own sustainability, as I'm sure many of my listeners already know. But what's the I was curious as you're going and learning all of these things about all of these non-human animals, I imagine there's a lot of pretty easy parallels to make with say a lot of primates. What's some of the furthest species from humans that you are drawing parallels to humans, that you're learning something about a bird heart or what have you?
Right. So I I love that question because I don't come from the field of, I did not train to be a behavioral ecologist or I come from the human side and then I kind of made this leap. I kind of had to invent my own way of looking at things. And a lot of my colleagues, so now I have an appointment in human evolutionary biology and at Harvard and at UCLA in ecology and evolutionary biology. And most of my colleagues have studied, either one species or one taxa, very often primates, not always, but very often, for the obvious reasons, right? A closer evolutionary relationship. Mm-hmm. But because I didn't have that background, I didn't start with that perspective. And instead, I was curious about how far leftward we could look. And if you're looking at a phylogeny, just turn your head to the left. If it's a horizontal phylogeny, how leftward we could look and still see those physical or physiologic connections. And the very 1.0 version of this was to just say, okay, breast cancer. So, okay, it has to be a mammal. So we'll go back a couple of 100 million years. But I would literally look for other mammals where breast cancer had been reported in the peer-reviewed literature, and then just kind of take a look at all these species and look for a common ancestor. And, not that necessarily proves anything, but just to kind of give myself a sense of, well, when did the vulnerability to these problems emerge? Who was the first mammal with breasts? Circular thing to say. And were they vulnerable to breast cancer? Why is it then that certain mammals seem to have less vulnerability than others? And those kinds of questions really instantly took me out of one narrow taxa and looking in a far broader way. The other piece of that, of course, is the new research that I've been involved with, looking at biodiversity as a source of solutions for complex human pathophysiology. So as a cardiologist, I've been working on a problem that there's a heart failure that happens in older people. It's caused by hypertension, high blood pressure. So if you just talk about the U.S., the demographics, we're getting older. High blood pressure is very common. And when the left ventricle, which is the ventricle that pumps blood to the systemic circulation, like any muscle, when it faces a higher workload, it starts to hypertrophy. It starts to thicken. And as it starts to thicken, it starts to fibrose. There are these changes that happen to its architecture that make it stiff. And what that means is, even though it can contract well during systole, which is that squeezing phase, during that relaxation phase, it's too stiff and the pressure doesn't fall. So the pressure inside the heart, in the left heart, rises and rises and rises into the left atrium, into the pulmonary circulation, and that causes heart failure, shortness of breath. So and by the way, I'm trying to focus my research on issues related to women's health specifically. So it turns out this form of heart failure is now the leading subtype of heart failure in women in the United States. So I thought, well, what animals, so the concept of turning to nature, to kind of thinking of biodiversity as just multitudes of variations in all of these physiologic components. I mean, every single, big, large. What other animals have ventricles that face higher, quote unquote, than normal pressure? It's normal for them. And of course, easily the answer is the giraffe, which, every medical student is taught that the giraffe has a thick ventricle because, she needs to pump blood from the, down here, the heart is between the legs, up to that brain a few meters, up there. And it's true. But there's another interesting reality about giraffe, and that is that they are prey animals. The leading cause of death among, giraffe on the savanna is predation. Mm-hmm. And so imagine the selective pressure on giraffes to not have shortness of breath and exercise intolerance, the precise symptoms that human beings who have thickened ventricles because of high blood pressure have. And in fact, what my lab's been working on, and what I'm very excited about is finding the adaptations, the differences between the okapi heart, for example, and the giraffe heart. The okapi doesn't have a long neck, right? And the modern giraffe and the modern okapi, they shared a common ancestor about 11.5 million years ago. And as the giraffe cervical vertebrate enlarged and that neck got longer and longer for reasons that have to do with improved fitness, and there are several theories about that, this new selective pressure emerged. And as a consequence of evolution's iterative over and over, there is this evolved adaptation that is essentially a roadmap for solving this form of heart failure in humans. So I love the idea of reconceiving biodiversity as something that is alive and relevant and so much more than just looking at the beautiful world and experiencing and appreciating it. All that is fantastic. But really recognizing that the treasure that it is also contained at a much more reductive level. So that's a lot of fun.
In terms of some mental health issues, are there any things with or not even just mental health, just generally speaking, are there particular issues with some of the challenges of animals in zoos having a limited amount of space, the hurdles that zookeepers need to face in terms of making sure that they have proper sloths, for example, are very finicky with their diet, or certain animals that need X amount of space, or often you go to a zoo and they show all of the different, they give elephants the various toys to play with and things to keep them stimulated and active. Are there things that we can learn specifically about animals in captivity that actually might translate to some of the modern human problems as we kind of tend to be domesticating ourselves in ways and sitting in cubicles and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that if people have there's when we look at animal behavior, right, there's a natural fear. I think it's been ingrained into all of us to not anthropomorphize, right? I remember when I was probably in 7th grade and we read Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, and my teacher said, don't anthropomorphize, right? So I think there's this natural, or at least I had a real hesitation about when I saw animal behaviors, whether it was on a farm or in the wild or in a zoo, of making a connection. It seemed like potentially scientifically a problem. But what I did is I went back to the definition of anthropomorphism, and if you kind of look at it in a dictionary, it's the projection of human characteristics onto a non-human animal. But that's actually not, I think, the right definition. The right definition, or a better definition, is the projection of human characteristics onto an animal in ways that aren't scientifically justifiable. And as we're moving into an era where we recognize that psychiatric disease is a brain disease, it's a biological brain disease, the way heart failure is a cardiovascular disease, right? As we begin to do that, and as we begin to, in the 1970s, we did not have comparative genomics and molecular phylogenetics and neuroimaging, all of these advances that are showing us how connected we actually are. That now when we see behavior that has similarities or is in some way phenomenologically similar, that we can actually, if there's an error to be made, it's not going to be anthropomorphizing, it's going to be the human exceptionalism that sort of has been at the basis of that fear. But the point is, there are behaviors that animals show, but not just in exhibit, but not just in zoos. You see it in lots of environments. In our homes, you can see it, even in the wild. But let's focus on the case of zoos because you asked that. So one of the things that animal behaviorists do and zoos do a lot of thinking about and work around is enrichment. They want to make sure that animals, our mental health is so, any animal's mental health is going to be related to activities, opportunities, environments. And so the recognition that social animals shouldn't be isolated because that can trigger stereotypy, sort of repetitive behaviors that are pathological, so that there's an attempt to kind of create a social environment. And that there's a certain amount of play that needs to happen and a certain amount of open space for certain species. All of those things are, this whole world of animal enrichment. This occupies a lot of time, energy, focus, and innovation among people who are in that field. I do think we can bring some of that back to humans, and in all kinds of ways. As you said, in many ways, our species is more captive than we are wild. We are everything from sort of the environments in which we live, how we access our food, the predictable nature of our interactions with others. All that stuff is more captive than it is wild. And one of the biggest ways in which we are more captive than wild is our relationship to food and our weight. And so one of the things that's interesting in zoos is that I think ecologists and people who think about environments recognize that part of dietary health and physical health is thinking about seasonality and the microbiome, and that part of eating is the planning and the strategy and the desire and the going for it and the failing and then the failing again and the failing again, because, you know, predators, carnivores fail far more often than they succeed, and then the getting of it, and then the tearing into it, and the, you know, the sensory, the pleasure reward, all of that sort of, you know, we animals evolved as eaters in that context where getting food was dangerous and thrilling and critical and very dramatic, actually. I mean, even talking about it. And yet, you know, you look at how we eat now, right? It's fast food is the opposite of that. Anyway, I think that people in the, I've gone to conferences with people who are experts in zoonutrition and animal behavior in relation to food, and they get that. They get the importance of that kind of stimulation. And I've actually brought that back, even with my own family, to, I was always busy. I was a busy cardiologist when I had kids, and my husband was super busy, and we were just like running. And, you know, I was not doing all of the components of making meals for sure. But I actually think it's part of the pleasure of eating, for me anyway. And I know that I was influenced by watching these descriptions of how animals eat in two different settings, when it's just given to them versus when they work. And that actually has influenced how I think about food and how I have my kids. So personally, that's been a change.
You make them chase after their meals a little bit.
I do. They have to rip into it tear the fascia off the bone.
That's fun. What kind of are you interested at all in? Mind you, when I ask this question, that I haven't actually read your books yet. Are you interested in kind of any vestigial organs or behaviors at all? I think I was just reading something the other day about hiccups and them and possibly tracing it back to fish. Right. And something or other about the way fish gills work and the swallowing of air, and this is like and it tends, like, preemie children tend to have hiccups more because they haven't fully developed, and I don't know exactly how true that is, but are there? Do you have some? It's such a fascinating. One of my favorite things is like these kind of holdovers. I remember reading about these sea turtles that swim from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of South America, and they are confused about why they would go all this way to lay their eggs. And the thinking is that it was because during Pangea it was perhaps just a river, and there was an evolutionary benefit to swimming across to lay the eggs, and it got further and further. Each generation just had to swim a yard further or whatever, and you skip forward a million years or a few million years, and now you have to travel this great distance that, from like a kind of creator point of view or something, like you wouldn't design something to do that. The turtles would, if they knew how to turn that off, would probably be better off just hanging out wherever they're born and not straying as far.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of the in Zoobiquity, well, first of all, the new book that Catherine and I wrote is called Wildhood, and it's really the result of a 5-year study we did looking at adolescence across the animal kingdom. We looked at the transition from the onset of puberty to sort of mature adulthood. We started just with chordates. We were just going to do vertebrates, but we actually did include crustaceans ultimately. So it's sort of the 600 million year history of adolescence. And I'm not being...
Oh, is that all?
It's a long time.
600 million, you're like, that's enough.
Well, I don't know if you've had adolescence, but it can feel that long. Trust me. But yeah, so our emphasis for years has been on development, sort of looking at how far left can we go and still see similarities in development. And we sort of talk about this horizontal tribe of adolescence, and the kinds of commonalities are so I'm using this term too much, but mind-blowing for me, even though I now spend all of my time looking comparatively. And I think, again, it's because some of this stuff just seems so uniquely human, right? We learn about puberty, and we learn about like virginity loss, and we learn about like peer pressure, all through this human cultural context. And at least I never thought about puberty in a crustacean or a fish or a bird or a reptile. So, but 5 years later, I know a lot about it. And one of the interesting pieces of just sort of related to the hiccup story or the turtles is when there's a cardiac problem. Most adolescents are obviously very healthy, thank goodness, but some do actually faint when they get scared. And I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but some kids have it more than others, but
I don't
you may have known
think
someone.
I've ever fainted. The first memory that pops up into my mind is I was at a buddy's wedding, and I was in his wedding, and we're standing up there in the sun, and his brother fainted.
Right.
And hit his head, and then I started thinking about that, and I was thinking about it so much that I almost fainted myself.
That's called vasovagal syncope, big fancy word. But yeah, what's happening physiologically is there's this paradoxical, it's not paradoxical, but there's this paradoxical,
seemingly paradoxical.
Seemingly. Well, for years I used to teach medical students that it was paradoxical, but then I took off my blindfold of human exceptionalism and then thought, oh my goodness, look at this. So what happens is that this scary thing, like in your case, seeing somebody faint or blood, so some people, the sight of blood, or the sight of a needle, or can trigger it. There is a paradoxical slowing of the heart, as opposed to what you would expect, which would be, the heart speeding up, fight, flight. So there's this parasympathetic slowing of the heart instead of the sympathetic acceleration. And that leads to the brain not getting enough blood. Boom, your buddy's skull hit the floor.
Yeah.
So anyway, that sort of seems like that's a real head scratcher. Why would we have this physiology that would allow us to faint? And again, if you have an anthropocentric lens, then the whole thing seems ridiculous and doesn't make any sense.
Not a lot of utility. We're not having a lot of like fainting contests, see who can be the best fainter.
Exactly. It doesn't. It's not even. You can't even invoke sexual selection unless that's So one of the things that we started doing was we started looking leftward, and we did a systematic review to identify every single vertebrate species in whom this thing called alarm bradycardia, which means like fear-induced slowing of the heart, had been seen. And we created this phylogeny. I mean, it was fish, amphibians, reptiles, lots of birds, lots of non-primate mammals.
Goats?
Goats, fainting goats is a little different. That's myotonic. But
what's going on there? I better know that one before I start, because I love those fainting goats, and I don't want to be spreading bad information. So if we can quick deviate just to
So the goats have myotonic fainting, and that's that's more the muscle. So what's causing them to faint is not a slowing of the heart like this other kind, but stress can induce that in them, and those videos are incredible.
Amazing.
Actually, spoiler alert, but for the students who take my class, I sometimes show that video for the final, and I show a series of videos of animals sort of fainting, or not all fainting, and then they have to do a 𝕊𝕙𝕒𝕟 analysis and sort of figure out what's going on. But the point is that slowing the heart down and then becoming immobile is really an excellent adaptation if you are a young vertebrate who hasn't the strength or experience to outrun your predator. Crypsis, it's called tonic immobility, and you see it you even see it in insects, becoming still in the face of threat. So the slowing of the heart is really just the mechanism that leads to the stillness. And I have video now after video of wild animals, mostly young, fainting. They're not fainting, but they are limp and seemingly done. And a predator releases the grip. and boom, they escape. So there's this very wonderful, clear story that you can tell connecting slowing of the heart to fitness benefit, across so many species. And then all of a sudden you're back to our little tiny 200,000-year-old species. And yeah, we have retained autonomic physiology that was very adaptive for our animal ancestors for hundreds of millions of years. Not so much today.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I look at my horrifying email inbox and I just kind of go right down. I pass out, which I find to be pretty adaptive sometimes.
Well, were you ever driving your car and you haven't? I mean, I had a terrible experience when I was driving and a truck crossed the midline, and thank God everything. But it was around the time that we were writing this, and I realized I had a parasympathetic event. I didn't faint, but yeah, that is that feeling of having. It's that your sympathetic nervous system is being suppressed and your parasympathetic, that slowing, that vagal tone is rising. So fear.
Interesting. Yeah. I remember I only went skydiving once. I'd like to go again. And actually the main reason why I haven't been again is because I found it to be rather boring. And there was just something about I built it up a bunch in my head. I was so excited. I got a little nervous jumping out of the plane, and which is what I was after. I wanted that, that good acute stress. That's the stress that we're after, not that chronic everyday stuff that we got to deal with. And that's what I'm after. I jump, I'm flipping around through space, and I was just like, this is very boring. And then I remember, because they didn't tell me that there's like a lead parachute that comes out first, and before that, and so there's like a split second, the lead parachute's out, and I'm like, this isn't slowing down fast enough. I wonder if something's gone wrong. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, okay. And that got me going a little bit. But there was like a little bit of a slowing there where it's just like, well, nothing else you can do in this situation.
We, for Wildhood, we looked at risk-taking adolescent animals. We were really curious, because we know
really? There's like the Tony Hawk of animals?
Well, they do things. Some of the things that you see wild animal adolescents do make like the worst episode of Jackass look like a poetry reading. I mean, it's pretty shocking.
Oh my goodness.
And one of the things that they do is a lot of animals, and this is we found this in invertebrates, we found it in fish, birds, meerkat, Thompson gazelle. They sometimes approach their predators instead of fleeing from them. It's called predator inspection. And I showed videos of this. It's so interesting. You see them, they do it, by the way, with conspecifics. So it's kind of a safety in numbers, right? They approach, you see these Thompson gazelle, in the background, and you see these 3 cheetahs, which is one of their main predators, in the foreground. And you see the young Thompson gazelle moving toward the cheetah and stopping. And then several other cheetahs are there and they're looking at them.
Those gazelles, they are like the Steve-O of the animal kingdom. They're always taunting with the jumping too.
Well, the springboks and the stunning.
I cut you off, but go on.
But it's the point is that, and so people have looked at predator inspection and said, what is it? Is it mobbing? When animals come together to sort of, say to their predator, hey, there's 10 of us, there's 3 of you, get the hell out of here. Or is this a learning behavior? And you see it in meerkats, you see it in bats. We documented a lot of it and put a lot of it into Wildhood. But it is a safety learning behavior. And to summarize the whole thing, when you're inexperienced as a young animal and you're going to disperse from your natal group, predator naivete is death. So
when you're around your group, before you set out on and try to make it on your own, take all of your chances when your parents are watching.
That's right. Take your chances when you've got others around. There's safety in number. And what's interesting is that in humans, human adolescents are more likely to take risks when they're with their buddies, which is one of the reasons why, at least in California, when your kids they get a learner's permit at about like whatever it is, 15 or 15 and a half. And for like 6 months or a year, there's all these rules. And one of them is you can't drive with your buds in the car. You can drive with an adult, but you can't. And the reason for that is the risk-taking threshold goes down. And I wonder whether that is a vestige of this this adaptive
That's lovely.
Safety, behavior.
Yeah.
Gaining knowledge.
Well, in Europe, you can drink, or a lot of states, you can like drink with your parents before you're allowed to drink legally. And
so it's so funny. I was thinking about that. We were in Europe, and I was thinking about that because one of my Danish colleagues was saying, "Oh, you Americans, you're so uptight about alcohol, and our kids, we don't have that problem because our kids learn when they're younger." And I remember when we were writing this book, and I was thinking, "Gosh." My kids were already kind of on the 19, 20. And I was thinking, I wonder what I might have done differently. And I remember that there was a night when my son wanted to practice driving. And I was in California at the time. There's not a lot of weather, but when it rains, it's real. And there's lightning. And I said, Charlie, it's dark. It's super rainy. Let's skip it. Maybe it's a little dangerous. And I think back now about that. I think, that is exactly what I should have done with him. I've been driving for decades. He would have had that experience, a little dangerous, but with me there so I didn't even think about it in those terms. So, there's...
And where were you in Europe? Because those Scottish will try to trick you into thinking that they like to tell themselves a story that they're responsible drinkers. But I spent a month in Edinburgh and pulled multiple blacked out zombies out of the street before they got ran over. So
I know. By the way, alcohol is another really interesting question. That in our first book we wrote a chapter called Zoophoria about, substance seeking in the natural world. And we sort of did a little bit of a Mythbusters. Some of the stories are like, I don't believe it. And
what if you give a spider LSD? Look at the web it will build.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, obviously fruit and vegetable matter does ferment. And there is going to be, it's going to get ethanolized. And so, you do have animals who are consuming, and by the way, fermented material is going to be a little bit calorically denser, so there's probably some advantage to it, and sweeter. But so it raises all kinds of questions. There are real instances of these waxwing birds that become, they're intoxicated and they fly in buildings and die. I mean, there's that, which is obviously maladaptive. But there is this kind of way of thinking about substances and addiction in the context of biodiversity too. Again, this thing that seems so uniquely human, it seems so culturally created and yet there's this neurobiology that makes us vulnerable to, intoxication that exists in all these other animals.
I imagine there's probably a little bit of sexual selection in there too, with disinhibiting some of those psychological barriers that would normally. I'm sure that humans aren't the first mammals to think, man, these kids seem to be a little bit of a pain in the butt and rather costly. But sex feels good enough. But I'm sure the alcohol knocks out some of those inhibitions as well, or other substances. It's not just alcohol. It seems like there's a few. Well, what is it? Isn't it what's the one? Isn't koala bears or something like that they say are basically just high all of the time, whatever that means? Yeah, I know. I mean, that's, again, a lot of the stuff is, you couldn't have an animal who's survived, was really had an impaired sensorium. I mean, if I were a predator, I'd be like,
Oh yeah, I'm going there. I don't think that, but but just because you brought up sex, I'm going to just go there for a second.
Sure.
So there's so much that we've learned about animal sexuality and human sexuality, and in Zoobiquity, we wrote a chapter called Roorgasm, where at that point it was really just a lot about the wide range of sexual experiences and spectrum sexuality in the natural world, and I think that story's pretty well known now, but it's still really interesting, and I think there's a lot of meaning in exploring it. One of the things that I do with students now is that we read behavioral ecology literature about oral sex in bats, both megabats and fruit bats. So we have 4 or 5 articles on.
Amazing.
Yeah, well, except I'm going to send you the articles there, and we do a Tinbergian analysis. So I no longer say, there is non-procreative sex in nature, because that's like an old story. What's interesting is
giraffes are there's all sorts of stuff going on there, right? Like a lot of homosexual behavior.
Of course, when we start to look, there's just if you can think of it, it exists. And so there's this, I think we're at a point now, I hope, where we don't have to be scared about, turning to the natural world for insights about human life. Like there was a time when people would say, if you find something in nature, then people will think that is normalizing or naturalizing. That's ridiculous. We know infanticide exists in the animal. What doesn't justify it? We know that necrophilia does. We know cannibal. No.
Right.
And in fact, what I know now, just having, spent so many years doing this, and I know a fraction of what actually exists, is if you and I can think of it, it exists in the natural world. So when someone comes back and reports on something, that is one species at one time and what their filter has shown them. The reality is that there is just a huge amount of biodiversity when it comes to sexuality. But the common compass...
That is the weird thing with that some people on first glance kind of try to put on evolution, that it's somehow like justifying it. Like evolutionary theorists are saying, like, well, look at bed bugs, therefore I can stab you in the abdomen and try to impregnate your stomach.
Well, it's bad science. I mean, if you identify it in a species, all that means is that in that particular population at that moment, you saw that behavior. There's no reason to generalize that, even to all bed bugs, let alone all insects, let alone all humans. That is the filter. I mean, when I was growing up, all I knew about wildlife was documentaries, right? We didn't go we went to the national parks. That was pretty cool. But we never, today people go to Africa. And so, and there was no YouTube, right? So what did I know? I knew what David Attenborough or who was it, Marlon Perkins or whatever all those guys were. And I loved those shows. Mm-hmm. But you know what? They were all guys and from one culture. And, even when you're well-intentioned, you can only find what you're looking for, right? So I think that now we know that wildlife biologists no longer have that heteronormative lens, fortunately, and a lot of the normative lenses are going away. And so and plus there's a greater, the diversity of biologists has changed too. Of course, we're all constrained by the fact that we're humans and, we still... But even so, I think that what we're reporting is the natural world is changing because the people who are doing the reporting is changing.
Yeah, and who knows what wonderful positions we're missing out on if we only looked to the animal kingdom. We could really be.
Are you going back to sex again?
I am going back to sex.
Well, by the way, you're making a joke, and now I'm going to be super boring about it. But there's so much foreplay.
I don't believe that.
There's so much foreplay in the animal world, and we actually study this in one of the classes that I'm teaching right now. We look at the adaptive benefit of certain pre-copulatory behaviors, and for example, in the bat articles, there was a study that was done on ground squirrel masturbation, and There was various.
You said this
I'm glad I'm
was gonna be
entertaining you.
boring.
This is what but the point is that.
Come on.
Okay.
What's boring about ground squirrel masturbation? Shame on any listener that's
You're
bored
laughing
by
out there,
ground.
The point is that we can ask it, we can put a 𝕊𝕙𝕒𝕚 frame on it. We can ask, what is the mechanism? What is the developmental perspective? What is the adaptive benefit? What is the phylogeny of masturbation? And in Zoobiquity, we write about that. In Wildhood, we look at that as well, because there are developmental characteristics. But as we start to do that, it simply is we're just really reporting scientifically on what exists. And the reason that there's a giggle attached to it is that it seems so uniquely human, because we've heard about it and experienced it through human culture. And yet you take 2 seconds and you take a look at just mammals. You take a look at the neurobiology and the neurophysiology of erection and erectile detumescence, and you look at orgasm across species. I mean, all of these things are the physiology that underlies it, from the neurobiology at a brain level down to the sequence of muscular contraction. Add to that the male and female homology that exists in the first few. So
endlessly fascinating. I mean, I think there is this inclination to think of this stuff as like lowbrow or what. I remember I had, I've had. 𝕊𝕙𝕒𝕚𝕦 was who you just wrote a paper with, was with the other person that I was like, can I have you on twice before I even interviewed her the first time, because I knew her stuff was going to be so fascinating, and talking about something like feces. It might seem like, little kids make jokes about poop or whatever, but to understand where our disgust mechanisms come from and why there's not some there's nothing like natural or right about being driven from or inclined. Why a dung beetle thinks dung is the most wonderful thing in the entire world, and most species try to avoid it. These are all not only incredibly fascinating, but have important implications for understanding this existence, our consciousness.
I think we should, if you want to get high school students interested in evolution, talk about sex. And you know what? We can talk about the pleasure of sex. Okay, so why is sex pleasurable? Mm-hmm. Why does pleasure exist anyway? What's adaptive about pleasure? And then you can begin to break it down and begin thinking about rewards and what kinds of activities are fitness enhancing. And all of a sudden, you're talking about evolution. And you're actually talking about physiology, and you're talking about a lot of high level concepts. But it not only does it make sense. And by the way, David Linden wrote a wonderful book about 10 years ago called The Compass of Pleasure, which and he really lays this out, this argument that that pleasure evolved to support fitness enhancing actions, but. Pleasure itself is such a great way of understanding animal motivation. And we get so giggly about pleasure in our own lives, like we're guilty about it and we're embarrassed about it. And yet it is an evolutionary legacy. And
it's so even saying like, why does sex feel good? And then once you know why sex feels, here's something I find myself thinking about. If sex feels good to increase sexual behavior, to then lead to more reproduction, why doesn't sex feel even better? And there would be this range, this spectrum. There are people who which it probably does. There might be, there's certainly people where people claim to be sex addicts or whatever else that maybe have this, and which brings us to maybe the utility of masturbation. Do you think that perhaps all of the competing drives that we have, it was a way of like satiating that, so that squirrel can go out?
It's funny. I'm going to be super nerdy academic on you, and I'm going to send
you're going to reel me in a little bit,
but,
aren't you?
Sorry, I've got this. Excuse me. But the ground squirrel paper actually offers 2 or 3 adaptive hypotheses and then sort of takes a look at the data and sort of says which one of the hypotheses is supported. And one of the hypotheses which was not supported was that subordinates, it was a way of subordinates who didn't have access to mates to sort of diffuse their sexual anxieties or tension. And that was actually not supported by that particular study. It doesn't mean that it's not the case, but yeah, I mean, I just think there's a way of
Oh, no, I was just saying it gets your mind off of, like, you have this competing sex drive, and then you have, like, a drive to get food, and you need to, like, so if you're a squirrel and you bust a nut, you can go out and get more nuts more readily without being distracted by your sex drive, potentially.
That reminds me of a fantastic video that went viral right before the outbreak, as I recall, and somebody, I don't know who filmed it, but it ended up on a Twitter feed. And the caption was, "When natural selection trumps sexual selection." And have you seen that video?
No.
Oh my God. So you see these 2 ungulates. I don't know if they're impala. I don't know what they are. And they're 2 males. And they're like kind of locked in this battle. Very dramatic. And you see in the foreground some other animals watching, the 2 of them doing this. And then all of a sudden, you see the animals in the foreground stand up, and way in the distance, there's a spot that's like you can't even tell that it's moving. But the animals in the front, the ungulates, they take off. But the 2 guys are like, right? This is sexual selection, right? They are having a dominance fight, I guess. And as they're doing this, they're absolutely oblivious. They are so oblivious to what else is going on. They're oblivious to the females and whoever else left. But we are watching the spot get closing.
I can't imagine 2 guys being oblivious because of their sex drive.
But then I cannot even when you see this thing, you're going to be immediately texting me and then all of a sudden you realize it's a lion. And I think it's a male. I can't remember if it's a male or, and then you literally see at the 11th hour, now 11:59, they spot it. One of them gets away, the other one is dead. And it's when natural selection trumps sexual selection. I was like, I don't know who thought of that caption, but I love it. So
you mentioned at the start of COVID, and I just mentioned the paper that you wrote recently. It was actually why I wanted to. I looked up all the names on there. Half of there was 10 different authors. Half of them had already been on the show, and so I figured it was good company. And that's how I found you. But it's called. I'll put a link to this on the new YouTube channel, and of course Here We Are podcast.com website. But the pandemic exposes in human nature 10 evolutionary insights. I love this as someone that's an advocate for evolution communication. This is another common misconception that people have is like, okay, great. We evolved. We learned to stand upright. Terrific. Done. What's that have to do with me? Right. And evolution and the things that built our sexual drives or our survival drives, our anxieties, everything else along the way have huge implications on our present life. With COVID going on, what sort of things spring to mind for you? What does kind of your lens on COVID differ from some of the other stuff you see out there?
Right. So they asked me to write about adolescence because of wildhood, and I've been talking a lot about adolescence across the animal kingdom. And one of the things that we know is not all animal adolescents, but a lot of them will disperse. And by disperse, we mean leave their natal burrow or cave or den and set off on their own. And when you disperse as an adolescent animal, you face a lot of challenges. One is finding enough food for yourself, right? Starvation is actually a leading cause of death for dispersing adolescent animals. And of course, predation, you're targeted because you're easy prey. But one of the other challenges is infection. So if you think about what are the kinds of things that can kill you as an animal, human or otherwise, predation, starvation, infection, trauma, extremes of temperature, et cetera, et cetera. Well, infection's a biggie. And one of the ways that animals, including ourselves, are prepared for leaving our natal environments at every stage is through something called immune priming, right? We are exposed to microorganisms that help to shape our immune systems. And so that is sort of interesting. So when the mother bird or the father bird brings food back to the nest, not only is the food itself coming, all the microorganisms in the environment are coming, and the young nestlings are having their immune systems shaped and optimized, right, for sort of tailor-made for the environment into which they're going to enter. Well, one really exciting piece of research that's been, developing over the last 5 years is the close connection between the microbial world, the microbiome, and brain development. And just to take a step back, so there are cells in our brains and the brains of many other animals that are called microglial cells. And in the brain, these microglial cells are the landscape architects. They are the cells that do the synaptic pruning and the myelinization and these actions that literally shape the brain, create the structure, but that lead to the cognitive differences, temperamental differences, all of these, all of the brain-related functions that an organism is going to have is going to be determined in large part by this synaptic pruning. Remember, during neurodevelopment, synaptic pruning is how we go from being, how our brains get really shaped and defined, and other animals as well. So these microglial cells in the brain, it turns out they actually are immune cells. They are immune cells that migrated from the yolk sac in the first weeks of development. And so they're actually macrophages, which are these immune cells, and they're in the brain, and yet they are fundamentally immune cells. And so there is this connection between the microbial world and these immune cells in the brain that are actually shaping the brain, optimizing the brain. Now, we know, of course, that the gut microbiome, the enteric microbiome, all of those trillions of non-human, the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi that live in the microbial environment, it turns out they are in direct and constant, not only communication with the microglial cells, but according to a Nature Neuroscience paper a couple of years ago, they are constantly controlling, they are deeply influencing the microbial communities of the host's enteric system, are deeply influencing these microglial cells, where they prune, This is, for the last couple of years, I've been really captivated because this means that the immune system is helping to shape behavior. That the microbial environment, which helps to shape the immune system, is helping to shape brain biology and behavior. Now, this actually makes a tremendous amount of sense. One, I think, reasonable and testable adaptive hypothesis is that that the microbial environment, that is information that a young animal, that is valuable for a young animal to have. And to have behavior, there are immune behaviors, right, that are shaped by that environment, that's a powerful piece of information. Just the way we think of the epigenome translating what the environment is like and telling the organism that's developing how to turn genes on and off to optimize the phenotype for the world into which it's going to enter. This microbial environment, right, there's information there that is being communicated to the microglia, which are involved in shaping the brain. So this is really interesting. So knowing that, all of a sudden, here are the kinds of questions we can ask. So first of all, we know that microbial exposures during adolescence and earlier in life during neurodevelopment sometimes can be very negative, right? We know that there is an association between exposure to certain viruses early in life, prenatally, and rates of schizophrenia. We know that some viral infections can lead to, all kinds of very catastrophic consequences. On the other hand, we know that it is important, certainly in laboratory animals, and there's some evidence in humans, that microbial exposures are critical to brain development. Abiotic mice don't develop appropriately from a neurological perspective. They don't have the right social behavior. So there is this information from the microbial world. And one of the I think the human side of it is that we know that exposure to antibiotics early in life, even during pregnancy, changes the microbiome and changes the risk of some neuropsychiatric disorders in humans, right? There's this, so we're beginning to see that there's this connection between the microbiome and brain function, brain development. And we know that the organisms that a young animal is exposed to is going to influence his or her microbiome. So what I've been thinking about with quarantine is this idea that, of course, there are some adolescents who are going to sneak out and do what they're doing. But, all in all, we have schools closed. We have a population-wide macro alteration in the amount of social exposure adolescents have. And as a consequence, they are being, in general, I'm generalizing, exposed far more to the natal microbial environment than they would be if they were in 10th grade and, going out here, there, probably having, whether they're having sexual experiences or whatever they're. So it is, I don't know whether it will be a positive or a negative. There's certainly some positives. I think there are kids who would have been exposed to viruses that could have caused problems. But there's going to be a difference in who population quarantine, generation quarantine is, just based on a change in the kinds of microbial environments that they have encountered. Because we know that across the animal kingdom, we see this immune priming during development that influences, all these things. So that was what I was really kind of thinking about is, in fact, what I had called the piece was coming of age in a microbial world. And they changed it to something else, but I don't remember what that title is. But I just love that there's a new perspective on everything. And the microbiome really does add something. And knowing that microglial cells are immune cells, and that in microglial cells, the landscape architects of the brain are being so profoundly influenced by the microbiome. I mean, to me, that is, I just want to sit and meditate on that. I want to take a 6-hour hike and think about that, because it just shifts everything that I thought that I knew about neurodevelopment. It's very exciting.
Well, hopefully there will be lots of abundant, cheap, accurate testing for people, and that would be a wonderful way to limit spread without all of the other downsides of the other things that we're trying to do with COVID. I should let you go here pretty soon. This is like, you kind of just opened up Pandora's box in my mind a little bit with that last. I love the idea of kids possibly not having the opportunity to build the same robustness in an immune system, and later on their immune system kind of falsely perceiving what wouldn't normally be a novel bacterial environment is now not just
Right.
meeting new
Well,
people is a novel
yeah.
bacterial environment, or so? Is this
Yeah.
kind of along the lines of like hygiene hypothesis type stuff?
Yes and no. I'm not sure it's pathological. First of all, I mean, the most important thing is that people respect quarantine and the recommendations of,
Right.
Experts in public health, because, everything is about relative risk, right? That's what you
We've
learn in
been
medicine.
saying that plenty on this show, so it's good to at least have some
Of course.
some pros and
I
cons.
hope that goes without saying.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that like what was so good, right? So I don't know that. I don't think I'm in a position to say better, worse, different.
Is there have you seen any evidence for something like the hygiene hypothesis, which is, for listeners, for me to quick paraphrase and butcher, just kind of maybe the immune system not getting the same number of threats that we would have in an involved environment, and the sensitivity to the immune detection kind of regulating upwards until it starts perceiving threats that don't exist, if that
Right.
was maybe too fast to make sense to people. But is there, I'm wondering within zoos, if they're in other non-human animals, if you've seen anything like this in terms of, obviously there's a very different microbial environment than.
Right. There are some, people look at wild versus domestic cats for, the presence of atopy and allergy, and have invoked hygiene hypothesis. But I'm actually not talking really about this. My argument had really nothing to do with hygiene hypothesis or anything like, old friends. It was really not about the immune system. It's more thinking about the reality, this new information that the microbial environment is shaping brain development and behavior.
Right.
And that there has been this coevolution of immune development and neurodevelopment. And that recognizing that has happened in that way, we can ask some really fascinating questions about why. Why is there such entrainment between the immune, the microbial immune interconnection and brain development? In what ways is it adaptive? And again, I think it makes a lot of sense that, our immune systems are partly, we've got the innate immune system and the, adaptive immune system, but there's also immune behavior, right? We back away from someone who is sick, right? There's this whole suite of behavior, which is part of our antimicrobial arsenal. And, that is shaped by our neurodevelopment. So it's just that the border between what is immune and what is neurological, all of a sudden those boundaries are being erased as we realize that the microglial cells, they look like brain cells, and they are brain cells, but guess what? They're actually immune cells, right? As we begin to see that the border between these systems are blurring and erased. So it's not really, the hygiene hypothesis has been great for looking at mismatch and the emergence of autoimmune disease in cleaner societies, et cetera, et cetera. And that's cool, but that's not what I was really focused on.
You're talking about synaptic pruning and little how the brain develops and finds efficiencies and categorizes and differentiates between different stimulus.
And gets optimized for the environment in an anticipatory way that's going to be entering.
I see. Well, I hope my listeners all check out Subiquity and Wildhood. Send me questions if you do. Maybe I'll be able to coax Barbara into coming back on and answering them sometime next year or something. And last silly question. This is otherwise would be controversial, but it's sort of a joke question. What animals out there would make for the best pets? I'm not condoning, I'm not saying go out and get yourself an exotic wildlife. But here, so first off, some caveats for this little thought experiment. So it's a situation like this where, so like, people go down to Costa Rica, right? Don't mess with, you see a sloth fall out of the tree into the water. You're like, I want to go and help it out. don't. It's a terrific swimmer. It likes the cannonball. It did that on purpose. Don't mess with it. It looks like it's smiling all the time. When you grab it, it's actually stressed out a lot, and it looks like it's smiling, and you think it's cute, but you're probably giving the poor thing a heart attack. But here's a situation. You see you got a female sloth gives birth to twins. It doesn't have the energy to care for both these twins. It's going to let one of the sloths see which one holds on the best. One's going to fall to the ground. It's not going to go down. And it's going to let this little baby sloth starve to death. You know, sloths are solitary creatures. They're not like dogs. People are taking pack animals and putting one dog in their home, which is an unnatural environment for it. You say to yourself, maybe I can have a sloth that's solitary anyway. I'm going to have them ship the perfect dietary needs directly from Costa Rica each week to me, and you do everything exactly right. That sort of a situation. The animal was going to die anyway.
I love it. I completely got the setup, and I have my own kind of version of that. So it's not only a guilt-free, eco-neutral thing that you're doing. It's actually altruistic. It's actually, I got it. Love the setup. Okay, so it's a hard one because my home is not really set up for having the pets that I'm going to mention. However, if we can use the same suspension of disbelief. So there are a few species I really admire who I'd love to hang out with because I think they'd make my life better. One of them, so I'm a musician and I love music, don't love to practice. And one of the cool things in Wildhood, one of our whole sections is on humpback whales and how the males learn the song. And they actually practice measures. They literally have, people have written this out in like a musical score form. They compose and then they innovate, and there's some fidelity in the songs across generations, but then they innovate and they literally practice. They do that little series of measures and they go over again and they go over again. So I would love to have, in the most humane, appropriate, I would love to have a humpback male learning his songs to coax me to practice. I'm not sure what that setup is. I need a little more. That's one.
That's one. I love that pick. So far, you're hitting home runs.
Okay, male only because they're the ones who practice the songs that way. I just want to be really clear about that. Okay. Sure. The second is just
so someone doesn't send you a female. Like, I got you something for Christmas. Oh, so close. A for effort.
Yeah, and plus, I would love to do that bubble net feeding. That bubble, you know how they do that, the bubble net feeding, the humpbacks?
Oh,
that's mind blowing.
I
want bubble net feeding lessons. I want help with my practicing. And you know what else? The breaching, that seems like that would be a great, it would take a lot of core for me to be able to breach out of the water. So there we go.
Yeah.
So I guess my humpbacks are more self-help for me than pets.
Sure.
The other animals.
You have a therapy humpback.
I have a therapy.
You have a little vest on it.
Exactly. And people can be judgy about it, but you know what? I don't care. And the second would probably be, I do think those corvids who problem solve using tools they just look so badass.
Oh, I think that thing's going to tear your house apart. I think that thing is going to get in there. It's going to get into drawers. It's going to open your mail. It's going to, it's,
okay.
Some things can be a little too smart to be.
Yeah, I know you're right. I don't want to have an animal that's smarter than I am, which is probably most of them. And then there was in Wildhood, we wrote about resilience and kind of grit in animals, and we looked at all kinds of studies that they didn't call it grit and resilience, but that looked at which meerkats, which hyenas, and I can't remember the other, are the most persistent at these puzzle boxes. They do these, they put like meat or a goat, I think, into the hyena's puzzle box, and they see which ones, will stick with it the longest and try. So I would say a spotted hyena, but I know that they, I don't know that I could trust them around the babies. So maybe,
What are you going? Female? The dominant? Are you getting the dominant?
I would want the queen. I would think I would want the high-ranking queen. Who,
aggressive,
by the way,
but okay, it's a bold choice.
She, she intervenes. We write about something called parental intervention. These high-ranking hyena mothers, if it looks like their daughters who inherit rank, if their daughters are not don't have what it takes to win a contest, they actually intervene. And it's like that college.
It's like yelling at the coach or something, or
exactly.
yelling at the ref or whatever.
It's like the college scandal, which I now can't remember the name of. Whatever with it, but so I think I'd take a female hyena, but I would I'd want to make sure that the grandchildren weren't around, because that could be that would probably help.
Right.
And so corvids, I do love the spotted hyenas. And and the humpbacks. I guess that'd be it.
Three wonderful choice. Well, I'm a little uncertain about the corvid. I mean, I love the logic of the corvid. I think that there's you're really missing some unintended consequences here. But I am for humpback, and I'm like, no problems there. I foresee no issues with owning a humpback. So what do I know? Well, Barbara, you were a terrific guest. Barbara and Horowitz, everybody, please, once again, check out her books, Wildhood and Zoobiquity.
And may I say, these are books that I co-authored with Catherine Bowers, and we're a team, and we research and write.
Awesome.
So it's a co-authorship.
Put her in touch. I'll get her on sometime as well. Cool. Sounds terrific. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time and sharing all of your amazing knowledge and life experience and terrific insights.
You are super fun to talk to.
Thanks. And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you next week. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Next week, Aline Cohn, behavioral economics, talking about a guy who, for science, intentionally lost 17,000 wallets all around the globe. See what conditions would cause people to turn them back in. What types of businesses would turn them back in? What types of societies? Climate? Ooh, does climate play a factor? You'll have to tune in to find out. Do I need more of a sales pitch than that to listen to next week's episode? Are you sitting there like, they lost 17,000 wallets for science? Nope. Sorry. I think I'm going to skip that one. Really? You listened to this show. You came all this way. You're almost 2 hours into this. That's how much you enjoy science. And you're sitting there, no, sorry. Just not interested in hearing about someone losing 17,000 wallets all around the world to see what happens. Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. Guess we're learning a lot about one another. Started listening back to my podcast recently. I've been trying to, guys, this is personal development stuff. I've been trying to work up the courage. The courage. It's more of a time thing, really. It's just like, I was already there for that conversation. I gotta sit through it again to listen to my voice. If you just naturally like hearing your voice recorded, I don't know what's wrong with you. I'm getting better at it. It's, it is challenging. And I think I'm going to learn a lot from it. I have still a lot of pre-recorded podcasts, but I think this new habit's going to lead to better highlight clips, because another set of eyes on it rather than just my editor. And I think that it's going to lead to me just seeing the things about me that might annoy you from time to time. I'll probably notice them. Fix them. Maybe becoming a better host. Who knows? So, hoping to make some incremental improvements in the quality of this show. Maybe some punctuated equilibriums. Maybe there will be a drastic improvement in my hosting abilities. Maybe getting rid of ads will make the show more enjoyable, increase my Patreon, and even though I'm not getting ad money, might end up getting more funds for this show, which could help make it better and help me have an income once again. And I have a couple other things that I'm working on, including starting a new podcast with 𝕊𝕤𝕤𝕪 too. And so always just trying to tweak things, build a little bit, improve. A lot of small things you probably don't notice, and hopefully some big changes over time as well. But I will say, I've really enjoyed doing these podcasts remotely, more than I ever thought that I would. I miss doing them in person. I miss touring and going to universities and checking out labs, checking out zoos, stuff like that. But I don't know if it's the remote or just that it's COVID and people just aren't on guard as much, or whatever it is. I just really like these conversations. They're a little more loose, they're a little more fun, they're a little more exploratory. Been doing longer episodes, going a little more in depth. And so I really think, when I started this podcast, and not even when I started this podcast, but I actually, I'm a big believer in not believing in yourself, like just from Jump Street. You're not going to like just pick up never having juggled before and start juggling 6 balls your first try. And instead of having confidence in putting yourself out there, getting the experience, making small incremental gains and improving. And so when I started this podcast, I was shaking, nervous every time I was doing an interview. And, I've always been decent at this because it's something that I'm really interested in. I'm passionate about this subject matter, but, it's been an ongoing process of getting more and more comfortable, learning more. And I remember when I first got way more into reading science books and stuff, being overwhelmed, I was always thinking, 5 years, like you might not like reading this book right now, but 5 years of reading books at this level, and you're going to be so much smarter than you are. You're going to know so much more than you do right now. And it helps me with the grind. And this podcast, having been doing it for like 6.5 years now, it can be discouraging that I don't have more listeners. Everyone always wants more listeners, but it wouldn't take much to double the listenership this year. And I feel like last year I started hitting my stride as a host, and so I'm just excited to get it out there for more people, and I think it's just going to continue to get better. And but I'm kind of happy that there's going to be a lot of newcomers. I hope that if you do get a chance to tell people about this show, I really appreciate it. Like if I had a choice between giving me $5 a month on Patreon or telling a few people a month, I would say, please, word of mouth. If you can do both, terrific. But I'll take word of mouth. I love getting this stuff out there. I love knowing more people are listening. And I think it's only going to get more popular. I think that I thought that COVID was going to be the time when people were going to start taking science a lot more seriously and get a lot more interested. And that wasn't the case. I talked with a lot of different science podcasts, and there's some that benefited, and it was the case that some people have gotten more into science, but it wasn't a dramatic change, and there was so much science denial, and then there was just so much visceral like aggression and conspiracy theories and everything like that toward the very thing that we depend on getting through this. And it's been quite the ride. And I think with a new administration and new communication and everything else, not just having a blowhard that will just make up whatever and just riff on things, and just like never say I don't know, never say, hey, let's listen to what the experts have to say on this. Just to riff on medical knowledge that you've never had a single interest in your life, and now you think because you're president you're going to take charge and create obstacles for scientists and spread disinformation and everything like that because you're worried about losing the spotlight. I mean, I don't think people even understand. I don't even think people that hated Donald Trump can understand just how bad he was as a leader, how incompetent he was, and just how incredibly awful of a job he did managing this. And I mean, this could have been a time for us to work together. And I think that now that things are going to change dramatically. I think science is going to be given the chance to take the lead on a lot of COVID things. I think things are going to rapidly, our lives will start improving. By rapid, I mean, it's still going to be a long haul. But I think from within that, people are going to be exposed to a lot more actual intelligent people that know what they're talking about. And that makes a really big difference than just the weird name calling and bickering and stupid showmanship and conspiracies and all that. And so I'm pretty excited to be in a place where I have all of this whole backlog of content and have all of these networks of people and relationships established and experience. And now I know a little bit more about what I'm doing as a host and asking better questions and have a lot more knowledge than when I started this thing. And I feel so grateful. I had a comedy podcast before this, and I'm going to have one again. And it's one thing to have a show and like learn little bits of tricks and stuff to get a couple more chuckles. And yeah, you learn a few things along the way, but man, every single one of these episodes that I do with the Here We Are podcast, I learn so much more than I would in a year on past podcasts, which is always just like, well, advertising how much you know and seeing who can be the most interesting and everything. And so I'm super grateful. I'm grateful for you guys. I'm thrilled that people care. I, of course, wish more people, everyone wishes more people cared about the thing that they're interested in. But I think that people have a long ways to go to understand just how truly important science is. It's the greatest tool that humans have ever come up with. We are primates that have basically turned ourselves into magicians using this incredible tool of science. So thank you guys so much for listening, and those of you that listen all the way to the end, you are, of course, my favorite.